It was a night when nature showed its fiercest face. Thunder roared across the skies, lightning slashed through the darkness, and rain hammered down like a relentless drumbeat. In the middle of nowhere, on a modest farm tucked into the rolling countryside, a single light flickered through the storm, a beacon of warmth amidst the chaos. Inside that farmhouse lived Jacob, a hard-working farmer whose life revolved around the land. His hands were calloused from years of toil, his clothes worn but clean. The farm wasn't thriving, but it was home, a place he cherished despite its challenges. Money was tight, and every day was a battle against debt, unpredictable weather, and the struggle to make ends meet. Still, Jacob held on to his values, the ones his father had passed down. Always offer kindness, no matter how little you have. On this stormy night, Jacob was preparing to turn in for the evening when he heard it. A loud knock at the door. It startled him, as visitors were rare in these parts, especially during such a tempest. Grabbing a lantern, he opened the door to find a drenched stranger standing there, shivering and desperate. The man was clearly not from around here. He wore a tailored coat, now soaked, and shoes that didn't belong in the mud of the countryside. His features bore the hallmarks of a man accustomed to privilege, yet his expression was one of vulnerability, humbled by the storm. "Please," the man said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I need shelter." Jacob didn't hesitate. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. He offered the man a towel, dry clothes, and a seat by the fire. There was no discussion of payment, no second guessing. Jacob simply acted on instinct, a reflex of compassion, even though he had little to give. But who was this man? Why had he ended up at Jacob's door in the middle of nowhere? As they sat by the crackling fire, the stranger shared little about himself, dodging personal questions with vague answers. Still, Jacob noticed something unusual, an air of mystery about him, as if he carried secrets too heavy to share. By the time the storm began to subside, Jacob could never have guessed how this simple act of kindness would alter the course of his life forever. Jacob's farm was a portrait of resilience. It wasn't the sprawling, state-of-the-art operation you'd see on glossy magazine covers. No, this was a modest plot of land passed down through generations, each one leaving its mark on the creaky barn, weathered fences, and fields that stretched just far enough to scrape by. The farm's struggles mirrored Jacob's life. He woke before the sun, toiling from dawn to dusk, determined to keep the farm alive. But nature wasn't always kind, and the last few seasons had been unforgiving. Crops had failed, bills had piled up, and the equipment was so old it felt like it might give out before Jacob did. Despite these challenges, Jacob refused to give up. He found joy in simple things, a good harvest, the laughter of his children, and the occasional quiet moment on the porch with a cup of coffee. The farm might not have been thriving, but it was his, and he poured his soul into it. That stormy night, the farm felt more vulnerable than ever. Sheets of rain pounded the roof, threatening to leak through. The wind howled, and the once sturdy trees around the property bent as if they might snap. Jacob had spent the evening securing what he could, tying down loose equipment and praying the barn wouldn't collapse under the storm's fury. The knock at the door was a jarring interruption to his routine. Visitors were rare in these parts, especially on a night like this. When Jacob saw the stranger standing there, drenched and desperate, his first thought wasn't suspicion or fear. It was empathy. After all, he knew what it felt like to battle forces beyond your control. He welcomed the man in without question, offering shelter as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The stranger sat by the fire, his hands trembling as he wrapped them around the steaming cup of tea Jacob had handed him. His clothes, though fine, were soaked through, and his face was pale, the kind of exhaustion that spoke of more than just the storm. Yet, despite his disheveled appearance, there was something dignified about him, as though he was someone who had been accustomed to control but had suddenly lost it. Jacob didn't press him for details. He had learned over the years that everyone had their reasons for keeping quiet. Instead, he offered what he could: a warm meal of leftover stew, dry clothes that hung loose on the stranger's frame, and a place to rest until the storm passed. "No need to thank me," Jacob said gruffly when the man tried to express his gratitude. "You'd do the same for me if our roles were reversed." As the night wore on, the two men exchanged cautious words. Jacob shared stories about the farm, his family, and the struggles of rural life. The stranger listened intently, his eyes flickering with what looked like recognition, though he still offered little about himself. When Jacob asked what had brought him out into the storm, the man hesitated before simply replying, "Business, but I took a wrong turn." It wasn't the full truth, Jacob could sense that much. But he didn't push. He knew what it was like to carry burdens you weren't ready to share. So he let the silence settle between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the relentless drumming of the rain against the windows. The hours passed, and the stranger visibly relaxed, his guarded demeanor softening. "You're a good man, Jacob," he said suddenly, his voice thoughtful. "The world needs more people like you." Jacob chuckled. "I'm just a farmer trying to get by. Nothing special about that." But the man shook his head firmly, as though he disagreed with Jacob's modesty. By the time the storm began to wane, the stranger was asleep in the spare bedroom. Jacob, too, finally went to bed, thinking little of the encounter. For him, helping a stranger was just another part of life. He had no idea that the man under his roof carried the power to change his life forever, a transformation waiting just on the other side of dawn. Morning broke with the soft, golden glow of sunlight filtering through the farmhouse windows. The storm was gone, leaving behind a serene silence. Jacob was up early, moving through the familiar rhythm of his chores, feeding the animals, checking the barn for damage, and surveying the land. The storm had left its mark: broken branches, scattered debris, and damp hay in the barn. Still, it could have been worse. Inside the house, the stranger stood. He came into the kitchen, now clean and dry, though the borrowed clothes still hung loose on him. "Good morning," Jacob greeted him. "Hope you slept well." The man nodded, his gratitude sincere. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Jacob move about with practiced ease. "You've got quite a place here," the man said, though his gaze hinted at the hardships behind it. "It's not much," Jacob replied, "but it's home." As they shared a simple breakfast, the man spoke little but scanned his surroundings with quiet intensity. Before he left, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table. "If you ever need anything, call me," he said. Jacob nodded politely, doubting he'd ever use it. The stranger gave a firm handshake, thanked him again, and left. Watching the car disappear, Jacob felt a flicker of curiosity but dismissed it. There was too much work to be done. But Jacob couldn't have known the weight of the promise that business card held, or how, by nightfall, everything in his life would begin to change. Jacob's day unfolded like any other. The hours ticked by as he labored in the fields, repaired tools, and tended to the animals. The storm had left its marks, but Jacob was used to weathering hardships, literal and figurative. By the time the sun began its descent, Jacob was exhausted but content, ready to settle into the evening. Just as he was about to step inside for dinner, a rumble echoed in the distance. At first, Jacob thought it was thunder again, but as it grew louder, he realized it was the sound of engines. Peering down the dirt road leading to his property, he spotted a convoy of vehicles approaching. Sleek black trucks, unfamiliar and out of place in the countryside. The vehicles pulled up near the farmhouse, and Jacob watched in disbelief as several men in sharp suits stepped out, followed by the stranger from the night before. This time he looked entirely different, confident, composed, and commanding. "Jacob!" the man called out, striding toward him with a broad smile. I hope you don't mind the intrusion." Jacob blinked, trying to process the surreal sight. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the trucks now unloading crates, machinery, and supplies. The man's expression softened. "This," he said, "is my way of repaying your kindness." Before Jacob could object, the stranger launched into an explanation. He was no ordinary traveler. He was a multi-millionaire business magnate with a deep respect for those who worked the land. "When I needed help, you didn't hesitate. Now it's my turn." What followed was beyond anything Jacob could have imagined. The convoy of workers set to work immediately, installing state-of-the-art farming equipment. Tractors, irrigation systems, and tools Jacob had only ever seen in magazines. They brought premium seeds and fertilizers, enough to rejuvenate the entire farm. Jacob tried to protest, his pride warring with his gratitude, but the stranger wouldn't hear it. "You've worked hard for so long with so little," he said firmly. "You deserve a break." As the evening wore on, the farm began to transform before Jacob's eyes. The barren fields now had the promise of abundance. The barn, once a creaky relic of the past, was reinforced and equipped to handle the new machinery. Even the farmhouse itself received attention, a fresh coat of paint, new windows, and repairs to the storm damage. Jacob's family stood in stunned silence, watching the whirlwind of activity. His children laughed as they explored the new tractors, and his wife wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the generosity. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. As the workers packed up for the night, the stranger lingered a moment longer. "This isn't charity," he said quietly. "It's an investment in good people. Don't waste it." Jacob could only nod, his voice caught in his throat. He stood there long after the trucks disappeared, staring at the transformed farm and wondering how one act of kindness had led. The changes to Jacob's farm didn't just improve his life, they rippled out far beyond what he could have imagined. With the new equipment and resources, the farm quickly became a model of efficiency. Crops that once barely survived now flourished, filling the fields with vibrant green rows of produce. For the first time in years, Jacob not only had enough to feed his family, but also to sell at the market and pay off long-standing debts. But the impact didn't stop there. Word of the farm's transformation spread quickly through the small, tight-knit community. Neighbors who had once seen Jacob's struggles now came by, curious about the sudden prosperity. Jacob didn't turn them away. Instead, he shared the knowledge and tools he'd gained, teaching others how to optimize their own farms using modern methods. Equipment that once sat idle was lent to those in need, and the community began to thrive together. The stranger's influence wasn't just in machinery and money. He'd planted a seed of generosity in Jacob, one that grew into something even greater. Jacob started a small cooperative, pooling resources with other farmers to ensure no one in the area would face the hardships he had endured alone. What began as a few helping hands soon became a network of support that lifted the entire community. Meanwhile, Jacob's family flourished in ways he hadn't foreseen. His children, once wary of the farm's future, found renewed excitement in the possibilities it offered. His wife, who had quietly borne the weight of their struggles, began to dream again, of vacations, better schooling for the kids, and maybe even expanding their home. But perhaps the most remarkable ripple effect was the hope Jacob's story inspired. A local journalist caught wind of the transformation and wrote an article about the farmer who had helped a stranger during a storm, only to see his kindness repaid 100-fold. The story spread far and wide, capturing the hearts of readers who saw it as a beacon of what humanity could achieve when generosity and gratitude intertwined. Donations began pouring in, not just for Jacob, but for his cooperative and the broader community. Small businesses in the area, from the local feed store to the market vendors, benefited from the newfound attention. A sense of pride returned to the town, as if Jacob's success had reminded everyone of the strength in unity and kindness. Months later, Jacob stood at the edge of his fields, marveling at what had been accomplished. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't charity, it's an investment in good people." He realized now what the man had meant. The real return on that investment wasn't in crops or money. It was in the lives touched and transformed by a single act of kindness. Jacob knew he could never repay the stranger in full, but he also knew he didn't need to. The best way to honor the gift was to keep passing it forward, ensuring the ripple effects never stopped. Months after the stormy night that brought a stranger to his door, Jacob's life had become almost unrecognizable. His once struggling farm was now thriving, a testament to what hard work, community, and an unexpected act of kindness could achieve. But even as Jacob enjoyed the fruits of this transformation, he often reflected on the man who had started it all. The business card still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. Jacob had thought of calling the stranger many times, not to ask for more, but to thank him properly. Yet, each time he hesitated. Words seemed inadequate to express what the stranger's generosity had meant, not just for him, but for his family and the entire community. One evening, as Jacob stood by the edge of his fields, he watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. His wife joined him, and together they marveled at the beauty of their land, now teeming with life. "It all started with that storm," she said softly, "and you opening that door." Jacob smiled, the weight of her words settling in. He realized that the true power of that night wasn't just in the material help they'd received, it was in the lesson it had taught him. That kindness, even in the smallest acts, can create ripples that stretch far beyond what the eye can see. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jacob made a silent vow to continue the cycle of giving, whether it was through helping neighbors, supporting local farmers, or simply offering shelter to another stranger in need. He would carry the legacy of that stormy night forward. As the stars began to dot the sky, Jacob turned to his wife. "Tomorrow," he said, "I think I'll call him. It's time to say thank you."